Welcome back to Tailstrom. Today's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest danger isn't what's outside your door. It's the people you expect to protect you. This is the story of a mother who faced an impossible situation, where a simple rule almost cost her everything. Let's dive in. HOA Karen blocks ambulance from coming to my house. Looking back, I never thought a simple rule could nearly cost my daughter her life. My name is Nicole, and this is the story of how a gate, a rule, and one woman's stubbornness almost changed everything. I often think about how much life can change in a single year. A year ago, I was living in a modest suburban home with my husband, Marcus, and our daughter Maria. We'd been married for just over a decade, and we'd built a life that I thought would carry us into old age. A comfortable place, a stable routine, and a feeling that even though there were always challenges, we could handle them together. But fate had other plans. Marcus was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer 18 months ago. The symptoms started subtly. He'd complain about stomach cramps, a bit of fatigue here and there. At first, we brushed it off as stress from work or maybe a passing virus. We never imagined it could be something more sinister. But as the weeks turned to months, the pain grew worse, and he began losing weight. Tests, referrals, scans, it all rushed by in a blur. And then came the terrible confirmation: cancer. In that moment, every petty worry became meaningless, overshadowed by the reality of our new fight. Over the course of his treatment, I watched him battle with everything he had. He tried chemotherapy, special diets, and an avalanche of prescription medications. He kept his spirits up, joked with the nurses, and always held my hand during the darkest moments. But the disease spread faster than any of us expected. By the time we realized that the treatments weren't working, it was too late for clinical trials or alternative methods. 5 months ago, he passed away in the hospital, with me by his side, my hand clasped in his, tears rolling silently down my cheeks as I tried to be strong for him in his final moments. Losing Marcus was like losing a chunk of my own identity. I was no longer Marcus and Nicole, that stable, grounded couple. Suddenly, I was just Nicole, a single mother to a bright-eyed 9-year-old girl who adored her father. Maria knew her dad was sick, but children never truly grasp the full scope of cancer. She would sit by his bedside, sometimes coloring or showing him her paintings. On good days, he'd muster enough energy to read to her or watch one of her favorite cartoons. On bad days, she'd try to be strong by being quiet, offering him tissues or water. We told her as gently as we could that he might not get better. But I'm not sure any child can fully wrap their mind around losing a parent until it happens. After the funeral, I realized that everything in our old neighborhood, every street, every neighbor, every local store, reminded me of my husband. The bench by the park where Marcus and I used to sit, the grocery store where we always did Sunday shopping, even the squeaky porch step that he had always promised to fix. It was all so filled with memories that I'd find myself unable to step outside without dissolving into tears or being overwhelmed by a flood of grief. So I made a decision. I would move, give Maria and me a fresh start somewhere else. Someplace where I didn't see ghosts of what we had lost every time I turned a corner. That's how I ended up in the gated community. A complex recommended by a coworker who insisted it was safe, peaceful, and the perfect place to start over. Truth be told, I just wanted quiet. I wanted a place where I didn't have to worry about break-ins or loud parties, or anything that might disrupt the fragile sense of calm I was trying to rebuild for my daughter. At first glance, it seemed ideal. The community was neat and well-maintained. Manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, small flower beds that lined the sidewalks. The homes themselves weren't enormous, but they had uniform aesthetics. White picket fences, pastel-colored walls, well-lit streets. A large gate at the entrance opened and closed with a passcode, giving residents a sense of exclusivity and security. I remember thinking, maybe this is the right place for us. Maybe here we can breathe again. The neighbors greeted me with polite nods and occasional small talk. Maria immediately found a friend 2 doors down, a girl named Jess who was the same age and shared her love for painting. For the first few weeks, everything seemed hopeful. I was still grieving, but every day felt a little less heavy. I started to believe that this move might truly be the fresh start we needed. But as anyone who has lived in a tightly regulated community knows, there's always a person who relishes pointing out every tiny regulation. Here in this community, that person was Amber. She was the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, and she carried herself with the smug conviction of someone who believed she was single-handedly preserving the neighborhood's aesthetic perfection. In my first month, she left 2 polite yet firm notices in my mailbox about my potted plants being out of alignment with the approved exterior decor guidelines. When I saw her walking her dog, an impeccably groomed poodle, she'd wave with a tight-lipped smile that never reached her eyes. At the time, it felt petty, almost comical. I'd come home from work one day to see a note stating, "Your pot of lavender does not conform to the approved color scheme. Please remove it or place it in a neutral-colored container." My first reaction was disbelief, and my second reaction was laughter. A pot of lavender was a violation? Really? But I complied just to keep the peace. After all, I had bigger things to worry about than fighting over a plant. After watching my husband fight for his life against a relentless disease, I found it impossible to become enraged over community rules or paint colors. It all seemed so inconsequential. My priorities were simple. Make sure Maria was safe, healthy, and happy. That was it. Everything else was background noise. Whenever Amber would appear, with her meticulously styled hair and that same neutral expression, nitpicking some minor violation, I'd force a polite smile, nod, and say I'd look into it. As time went on, I realized she wasn't picking on me exclusively. She was just that controlling with everyone. Still, something about her watchful eyes made me uneasy, but I brushed it off. In a way, I had no energy to waste on these battles. My emotional reserves were still depleted from my husband's final days. Yet in the back of my mind, I felt a faint nagging that maybe the sense of safety was superficial, like living in a bubble that could pop at the slightest pressure. Deep down, I knew that a locked gate might deter typical external threats, but it could also keep danger in if something were to go wrong. I never expected that this fleeting worry would one day become a horrifying reality. I still remember the day of the neighborhood birthday party so vividly. It was for a little boy named Caleb who lived 3 streets over. Caleb was turning 8, and his parents had set up a simple yet fun celebration in their backyard. They had balloons, streamers, a piñata, and a table heaped with all sorts of colorful treats. Cupcakes, cookies, fruit trays, and chips. It was the kind of small, communal celebration that made me briefly appreciate living in a neighborhood where kids could just be kids, running around without constant adult supervision. Maria was excited because Jess, her new friend, was also going. After losing her father, she'd grown quieter, and she still struggled to smile the way she used to. But that day, she seemed genuinely happy. She wore a pink t-shirt with sparkly butterflies and matching shorts, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. I'd made a mental note to keep an eye on her dietary restrictions, as I always did. Maria had a severe peanut allergy. Not a mild one. Not the kind you can dismiss. Even a trace amount could send her into anaphylactic shock. Ever since she was little, I'd carried an EpiPen with me everywhere. My safety net in case the worst happened. Caleb's parents, Scott and Denise, were friendly folks. They'd lost track of the specific allergies among the community kids, so they had a large variety of snacks. I told Denise in advance about Maria's peanut allergy, and she assured me she would label anything that might contain nuts. "Don't worry," she said. "We've got it all under control." Generally, I tried to be vigilant, but I'd gotten used to the routine. Check the labels, ask the adults, watch Maria carefully. We'd navigated 9 years without any major incidents, thanks to a combination of luck and caution. The party started normally enough. The kids ran around playing freeze tag, giggling and shrieking as they zigzagged across the yard. I chatted with a few neighbors, sipped on lemonade, and tried to be sociable. I felt a little pang when someone asked, "So, is your husband coming?" But I mustered a polite response, explaining that he had passed away recently. The pity in their eyes was the same pity I'd seen 100 times by then, and I tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. Around half an hour in, I saw Maria headed toward the snack table. She grabbed a cookie from a plate that looked harmless enough. Chocolate chip, or so I assumed. Busy in conversation, I glanced over only occasionally to check on her. She took a bite, still laughing, and then began chatting with Jess. Just a typical scene of two kids enjoying a birthday party. But just a few minutes later, I saw a subtle shift in Maria's expression. Her cheeks turned a splotchy red, and she started scratching at her arms. I froze. That was always the first sign. Heat rose to my face, and I felt my heart pick up speed. My mind raced. Did she just eat something with peanuts? I rushed to her side, calling her name. She was panting slightly, her eyes wide and scared, as if she herself couldn't believe this was happening. "Mom," she whispered, my throat. "It feels weird." Denise rushed over, looking concerned. "Are you okay?" she asked, voice trembling. She glanced at the cookie plate and realized her mistake. One of the varieties was peanut butter chip, and it hadn't been clearly labeled. There it was, a single oversight that could cost my daughter her life. My hands shook, but I knew what to do. I rummaged in my purse, yanked out the EpiPen, and quickly administered the injection in Maria's thigh. It was something I'd done before, once at a restaurant where a mistake had been made in the kitchen, another time at a family gathering when a cousin had unknowingly used peanut oil in a dish. Both times, the EpiPen had worked wonders, stabilizing Maria until we could get her to the hospital for observation. But this time, the reaction hit her faster, more aggressively. Her face was swelling, her breath coming in rattling gasps. I felt a surge of panic, more intense than ever. "Somebody call 911. I shouted, my voice echoing across the yard. A few neighbors scrambled for their phones. I reached for my own. It seemed like everyone was talking at once, a dizzying cacophony of fear. I managed to keep Maria upright, pressing her to my chest. She was coughing, her eyes wet with tears. "Mom, I can't breathe," she gasped. The 911 operator picked up almost instantly. My words tumbled out in disjointed bursts. "Daughter? Severe peanut allergy? EpiPen administered. Still can't breathe. Send an ambulance." The operator assured me help was on the way, but as I looked at Maria, I wondered if we even had enough time. I scooped her into my arms, ignoring the alarmed looks from other parents. I needed to get out to the street, to where the ambulance could find us faster. My legs felt like they were made of lead and adrenaline at the same time. It was a surreal moment. The bright balloons bobbing in the background, the faint smell of barbecue in the air, and my daughter's life hanging in the balance. As I dashed toward the entrance of the street, I cradled Maria, her labored breathing echoing in my ears. Every second felt like an eternity. It never occurred to me that the ambulance might not make it through the gate. Why would I even consider that possibility? It was an emergency, and gates were supposed to open for emergencies. At that time, I still believed that the greatest danger was the allergic reaction itself. Little did I know we were about to face something even more infuriating. Standing by the main road, I could hear the faint wail of sirens in the distance. Relief in the form of paramedics was approaching. My daughter was growing weaker, her complexion fading to a sickly gray, her eyes fluttering with exhaustion. I tried to keep her conscious by talking to her, saying, "Stay with me, baby, keep your eyes open," but she was slipping into a frightening haze. Finally, the ambulance appeared, speeding toward the front gate of the community. All they had to do was enter the code or wait for the security guard, something that should have taken a matter of seconds. But as the ambulance drew closer, it jerked to a halt. From where I stood, I saw the bright red and white vehicle idle at the gate, lights flashing, sirens screaming into the otherwise quiet afternoon. My immediate reaction was confusion. Why weren't they coming through? I moved as fast as I could in that direction, practically stumbling over my own feet. My brain struggled to process the scene. As I got closer, I realized someone was standing by the gate control panel, facing the ambulance. That person was Amber, the HOA president herself. She looked strangely rigid, her arms folded across her chest. The paramedics gestured frantically at her. One of them even hopped out of the driver's seat and tried to talk to her, but she shook her head. I saw her point at a clipboard, as though she were asking for documentation. My chest tightened with disbelief. When I finally got close enough to hear, I caught fragments of their conversation. Paramedic, this is a medical emergency. A child is in danger. Amber, you need proper authorization to enter this community without a scheduled visit. Where's your documentation? Paramedic, we don't need documentation for an emergency call. Open the gate. She shook her head again. Her face was set in a stoic mask, but her eyes flickered with something like annoyance, as though the ambulance was inconveniencing her day. Rules are rules, she insisted, her tone unervingly calm. We have procedures in place. Couldn't believe it. My mind was racing. Is this woman serious? She can see the lights flashing, hear the sirens screaming. My daughter is dying. Does she think this is a drill? A hoax? My throat tightened with anger, and I felt a boiling rage bubble up through my chest. I clutched Maria close to me. She was barely conscious, her breath rattling. If we didn't get her to the ambulance's oxygen, to the ER, she could slip away forever. I stumbled toward Amber, my voice cracking as I shouted, "Open the gate! Amber! My daughter's in anaphylactic shock." My tears blurred my vision, and everything felt surreal, as though I was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. But Amber simply shook her head, her hand hovering over the control panel. "We've had issues with unauthorized vehicles," she said, her voice carrying a maddening calm. "I can't just let anyone in." The paramedic tried to reason with her again. "We can't waste time. If you won't open it, at least let us through on foot." But Amber stepped in front of the gate, blocking the path. Her posture said it all. She was standing her ground, no matter the cost. In that moment, something in me snapped. The grief of losing my husband, the stress of raising my daughter alone, and the sheer terror of watching her fight for breath all coalesced into a single volcanic fury. "You're going to let my daughter die over some stupid rule about documentation?" I screamed. "You have the code. Open the gate." I remember seeing a flicker of doubt in her eyes, just for a split second, but she steeled herself. "If the ambulance can't prove they're here for a legitimate emergency, we can't compromise the safety of the entire community." Her words were robotic, as though she were quoting some manual. The paramedic, a young woman with sweat trickling down her brow, practically begged, "We're responding to a 911 call. That alone is proof. For God's sake, move." But Amber remained stubborn, as if she believed she was doing the right thing. I felt a sense of utter helplessness. Here we were, not endangered by criminals or accidents on the road. We were endangered by the very system that was supposed to keep us safe. This locked gate and a woman who refused to see reason were now the biggest threats to my daughter's life. The second paramedic, an older man, turned to me with anguish on his face. "Ma'am, you said she was having an allergic reaction? We need to administer oxygen and more epinephrine." His gaze darted around, as though searching for a solution. We both knew that every second counted. I looked down at Maria, her eyes half closed, tears streaking her cheeks. A wave of memories hit me. Her first birthday party, her giggling in the bathtub covered in soap bubbles, the way she'd thrown her arms around her father when he was too weak to walk. I remembered promising her that I'd always protect her. Yet here I was powerless. My child's life was slipping through my fingers, blocked by a gate. With trembling legs, I moved toward the control panel, hoping to input the resident code myself. But Amber stepped in front of me, physically blocking my access. "Don't even think about it," she warned. That was the final straw. I was done pleading, done reasoning. "Maria's dying," I screamed. "Get out of my way." Even then, she refused to budge. In a state of near delirium, I found myself trying to physically push her aside. She resisted, her face pale but resolute. The paramedics yelled, "Let us help her," but Amber seemed immune to their pleas. In that chaotic moment, I realized the horrifying truth. The danger wasn't some external threat. The real threat was a woman so blinded by her sense of power and rules that she'd condemn a 9-year-old child to death rather than bend those rules. It was the starkest example I'd ever seen of how regulations that are supposed to keep us safe can become deadly when enforced without an ounce of empathy. Maria's life was on a timer, and each second that passed without proper medical intervention felt like a bullet speeding toward us. The paramedics were at the mercy of this unhinged gatekeeper. I saw the younger paramedic glance toward the ambulance, his hand gripping the door as though he was considering something drastic. Could we drive around the gate? No, there were concrete barriers lining the entrance. Climb over the fence? Not with the stretcher and equipment we'd need. My maternal instinct kicked into a gear I didn't know I had. When you're about to lose your child, you discover a brand new type of desperation. My voice, raw from screaming, cracked as I called out to the paramedics. Ram the gate. Just ram it. It might have seemed insane, but we were beyond conventional solutions. Everything else had failed. They hesitated. Their eyes flicked to the ambulance, a vehicle that wasn't exactly designed as a battering ram. But they also recognized the gravity of the situation. The older paramedic grimaced and barked something into his radio. The younger one jumped behind the wheel. Amber, realizing what was about to happen, stepped back, a mixture of shock and indignation crossing her face. She started shouting, "You can't do that. This is private property." But nobody was listening to her anymore. Compassion had finally trumped her precious rules. I clung to Maria, who was barely conscious, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. My heart pounded in my ears. The ambulance reversed a short distance, then lurched forward with a loud roar. Its front bumper collided with the wooden gate, splintering it in a shower of broken pieces. The sound of impact reverberated through the air, followed by a brief screech as the ambulance forced its way inside. Amber staggered back, yelling about damages, but the paramedics ignored her. The vehicle careened to a stop near us, and the doors flung open. They rushed out, oxygen tank and medical bag in hand. Finally, mercifully, they reached Maria. One paramedic stabilized her neck while the other slipped an oxygen mask over her face. Another injection was given, this time with stronger medication to combat the swelling. I dropped to my knees beside her, tears streaming down my face. The relief was instantaneous, though I wasn't certain if she'd recover fully. I just needed her to keep breathing until we got to the hospital. They lifted Maria onto a stretcher, moving quickly but carefully. I climbed into the ambulance alongside her, my hands trembling as I continued to hold hers. Her eyes fluttered, and she made a small, rasping sound, but I could tell the oxygen was helping. "Stay with me, baby," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. The paramedics slammed the doors, and we peeled away, sirens howling, weaving through the community's neat streets toward the exit that would lead us to the main road and, finally, to a hospital. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked in a tight dance of competence, hooking up monitors, checking vitals. I gave them every detail about Maria's medical history, the severity of her peanut allergy, the last time she used her inhaler, the typical dosage of her medications. They nodded, adrenaline fueling their movements. Despite the chaos, I felt a flicker of hope. For the first time since the ordeal began, I had a sense that maybe we'd managed to outrun tragedy. As we sped away, I caught one last glimpse through the back window. Amber stood among the broken splinters of the gate, staring after us with what looked like a mixture of fury and disbelief. The pristine facade of the gated community was tarnished by a shattered entrance, but I couldn't care less. My daughter was alive, barely but alive, and that was all that mattered. In the swirling mania of that ride, memories flooded my mind. I recalled the day I first found out I was pregnant. That sense of anticipation and fear blended together. I remembered the first time Maria crawled, how she would always pick up any crumb she found on the floor and try to eat it. Even back then, we worried about her allergies. Then memories of Marcus, how he'd beam whenever he held Maria's tiny hand in his. Everything in my life had led to that moment, protecting my child with the same passion he'd always displayed. Now, if she could just pull through, if we could just reach the hospital in time, maybe I'd be able to keep my promise to protect her. The paramedics' radio chirped with updates from dispatch, traffic conditions, available hospital units. I barely registered the words. My entire focus was on the rhythmic rise and fall of Maria's chest under the oxygen mask. Slowly, her color started to improve. Her eyes drifted open for a moment, and she weakly squeezed my hand. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, a wave of relief coursing through me so intensely that I started sobbing. The older paramedic placed a hand gently on my shoulder. "She's going to be okay," he whispered, although I knew we still had to get to the ER. We still had to make sure the reaction was fully under control. But at least she was breathing. By the time we reached the hospital, Maria was somewhat stabilized, but still in a precarious state. The paramedics wheeled her into the emergency room, calling out her vitals to the medical staff who met us at the doors. I stumbled after them, feeling disoriented, my mind replaying the frantic scene at the gate over and over again. How close we'd come to losing her. How unbelievably pointless the delay was. It was one thing to lose precious moments because of a traffic jam or miscommunication, but to be held up by someone who refused to open a gate for an ambulance? It was unthinkable. For the next several hours, I hovered by Maria's hospital bed while doctors and nurses did their best to combat the severe allergic reaction. Her airways had been dangerously constricted. If we'd been delayed any longer, the outcome could have been different, a fact that one of the nurses grimly confirmed. "It was a close call," she said, eyeing me sympathetically. "It's good they got to her when they did." When Maria finally drifted into a more stable sleep, I stepped out into the hallway, my legs like jelly. I leaned against the cool wall, letting my eyes close for a moment. I felt physically and emotionally spent. I should have been feeling nothing but gratitude that she was alive. But instead, I felt a growing anger, an unyielding fury at a system and a person who'd nearly caused her death simply because they were too bound up in rules to see the human being in front of them. I vowed then and there that I would not let this go. You learn when you face life or death situations that sometimes letting things slide can come back to haunt you. Marcus had always said, "Don't pick battles that aren't worth fighting," but I knew he would have wanted me to fight this battle, for our daughter's sake and for anyone else who might need help one day. If someone like Amber was so callous, so unyielding, who's to say she wouldn't do it again? And what if, next time, the paramedics weren't able to break through in time? Maria spent 2 days in the hospital under close observation. During those nerve-wracking 48 hours, she underwent breathing treatments, for medications, and a battery of tests to ensure her body had fully recovered from the anaphylactic shock. Each day, I stayed in the hospital room, dozing uncomfortably in a stiff chair, holding her hand whenever she stirred. With every passing hour, her vitals improved, and her color returned. It felt like waking from a nightmare when we were finally told she was stable enough to go home. She left with instructions to take it easy, to rest, and to follow up with her allergist. But she was alive. She was going to be okay. That knowledge was a balm to the deep panic I'd been living with. Still, the memory of that locked gate and Amber's face loomed in my mind like a storm cloud. Back at the gated community, I was met with neighbors who had heard fragments of the story. Some had watched the ambulance charge through the gate with their own eyes. Scott and Denise, the birthday boy's parents, were especially distraught. They kept apologizing for the mislabeled cookies, for the near-fatal reaction. I didn't blame them. Accidents happen. Yes, it was a mistake, but they had tried to do the right thing. Much different from Amber, who had knowingly obstructed help. The gate itself was still damaged, a chunk of it missing, twisted, and splintered from the ambulance's impact. Maintenance crews were already at work removing the broken sections and installing a temporary barrier. According to the neighborhood's rumor mill, Amber was furiously lodging complaints about the destruction of property. I heard whispers that she had plans to fine the paramedics, an absurd notion that showcased just how deeply entrenched she was in her own delusions of power. I refused to give her that satisfaction or even engage with her face to face. What I wanted went far beyond any HOA squabble. My first step was to gather every piece of evidence I could. I obtained the official 911 call transcript and the emergency dispatch recordings. They documented how the paramedics had been delayed at the entrance, how they'd argued with someone on site who wouldn't open the gate. Then, I contacted the paramedics themselves, who were more than willing to provide written statements about how Amber had obstructed them from attending to a critically ill child. One of them even had body cam footage, as some ambulances in the area were equipped with cameras for legal and training purposes. Though the footage wasn't the greatest quality, you could clearly see Amber standing there, refusing to let them pass. With all of this evidence in hand, I filed a police report. The officer who took down my statement looked astonished when I recounted the incident. "She didn't let the ambulance in?" he asked, incredulous. "Because of paperwork?" I nodded, eyes burning with anger. He shook his head, muttering under his breath about how some people had no sense. The next step was pressing charges against Amber for reckless endangerment, obstruction of justice, and interference with emergency medical services. It wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring she faced the consequences of her actions. Actions that could have cost my daughter her life. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood. Many residents, who'd had their own run-ins with Amber's rigid enforcement of trivial HOA rules, offered me their support. A few recounted smaller incidents, like how she'd once locked a landscaper out because he forgot his ID badge, or how she'd threatened an elderly neighbor with fines for not trimming a hedge to the exact required height. But none of those stories had the life-or-death intensity of what had happened with Maria. This was on another level entirely. Before long, Amber was arrested, hauled from her immaculate home by local police. She looked incredulous, her face flushed with anger as they placed handcuffs on her wrists. The news made local headlines. HOA president arrested after blocking ambulance. Some reporters even tried to contact me, but I was selective about who I spoke with. My priority was still Maria's health and well-being. The court proceedings were grueling. Amber, through her lawyer, attempted to argue that she was just following protocol, and that the paramedics failed to provide the necessary credentials. Yet the prosecutors laid out a timeline that was impossible for her to refute. The 911 call, the sirens, the shouting for help, the clear statements from the medical team. All of it pointed to her conscious decision to delay an emergency response. The body cam footage sealed the deal. Even her stoic expression on that video, standing there with her arms crossed, seemed to speak volumes about her willful disregard for the situation. I sat in the courtroom, hands trembling, as I listened to the lawyers argue. When the judge handed down the sentence, 6 months in jail, I felt a wave of relief. It wasn't a long sentence, but at least it was something. She wouldn't just walk away with a slap on the wrist. She would have time behind bars to reflect on how her actions nearly killed a child. At the same time, I pursued a civil lawsuit against the HOA. If Amber was capable of such an outrageous abuse of power, then the structure of the HOA itself needed an overhaul. Their regulations had to be examined, especially the ones regarding access for emergency vehicles. My lawyers argued that the HOA shared responsibility because they hadn't set proper protocols or insisted on an override for urgent medical situations. It took months of negotiations, but eventually, they settled out of court. Part of the settlement included financial compensation for the emotional distress and medical bills, but more importantly, the HOA was compelled to change their policies. From now on, every emergency vehicle would have unrestricted, immediate access to the community. Further, the new bylaws mandated that all board members, including any future HOA presidents, undergo CPR and first aid training, so they'd never again treat a medical emergency like a bureaucratic annoyance. When the legal battles finally concluded, I felt a sense of closure. Nothing would erase the terror of that afternoon, but at least I knew I had done everything in my power to make sure it wouldn't happen to another family. For the first time since moving to the gated community, I could breathe a little easier, knowing real changes were being implemented. It was a reminder that sometimes you have to fight to turn pain into progress. Life after the trial felt like stepping into a new chapter. After months of turmoil and tension in the neighborhood, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere of the community. The broken gate had long been replaced, this time with a more advanced system that automatically granted access to emergency responders. There was no further debate. Nobody dared question the necessity after what had happened to Maria. For a while, I wondered if I should move again. Perhaps find a place with fewer regulations and no communal boards. But in the end, I decided to stay, mostly for Maria's sake. She was settled into her new school, had made friends, and was finally seeming to recover her sparkle after losing her dad. She'd survived a horrifying ordeal, and I thought uprooting her again might do more harm than good. Besides, I couldn't deny that, under the new rules, the community was safer than it had ever been. The settlement money was significant, though I never viewed it as some kind of windfall. Part of me wished the entire situation had never happened. No sum of money was worth risking my daughter's life. Nevertheless, I decided to use some of it to support local charities, particularly those focused on allergy awareness and emergency medical training. One of the organizations I donated to provided free EpiPens and training to low-income families who otherwise might not be able to afford this life-saving device. The rest of the money I put into a college fund for Maria. It felt right to tie the settlement to her future. After all, this ordeal centered around the threat of losing her. Now, every time I add a little more to that account, I remind myself how precious her life is, how it almost slipped away because of one person's obstinacy. It's a sobering reminder to always stay vigilant, but also to appreciate the simple fact that she's still here, still smiling and growing. Over time, I found a renewed sense of purpose. When you face a brush with tragedy, it's natural to either shut down or open up. I chose to open up, at least that's what I tried to do. I took my experiences public, speaking at local schools and community centers about severe allergies, the importance of immediate emergency response, and the catastrophic consequences that can occur when rules overshadow compassion. Sometimes, I'd stand in front of a small group of parents or even a larger community forum, sharing my story. I'd emphasize that allergies aren't just a small inconvenience. They can be deadly. And I'd highlight how life-saving interventions can be delayed or denied by something as simple as a locked gate if the people in charge fail to exercise common sense and empathy. The first few times I spoke, my hands shook and my voice cracked. I wasn't accustomed to public speaking, and each retelling forced me to relive the horror of seeing Maria's face go pale and lifeless. But as the months passed, I discovered a strength I hadn't realized I possessed. The same fury and determination that propelled me to fight for legal justice now propelled me to share our story. I wanted to make sure that no other child would face a locked gate while every second counted. Maria, for her part, eventually returned to her routine of playing with Jess, doing arts and crafts, and focusing on her schoolwork. She still carried the trauma. After all, she had nearly died. But kids are resilient. She had nightmares at first, waking in a sweat and calling my name, but those became less frequent. We talked openly about what happened, reassuring her that she wasn't to blame. I never wanted her to carry guilt for accidentally eating the wrong cookie. It was never her fault. Adults are supposed to protect children, and in that moment Amber had let her down. The paramedics and I had ultimately saved her, but the memory of that delay still stung. Amber went off to serve her 6-month sentence. I didn't attend her sentencing hearing or visit her in jail. I wanted no part of it beyond ensuring the legal process took its course. Some neighbors gossiped about how she was railroaded by the system or how she was just following the rules, but the majority recognized the severity of her actions. Interestingly, a handful of people, likely her close friends or those who feared the HOA's authority, distanced themselves from me after all this. They accused me of making a spectacle or ruining the community's reputation, but I refused to argue. As far as I was concerned, I had nothing to prove to them. The new HOA board was much more cooperative. They worked with local emergency services to create a robust system for medical crises. Everything from digital passcodes for ambulances to mandated training. They even began distributing pamphlets on how to identify signs of severe allergic reactions. The difference was night and day. Where once the focus was purely on aesthetic uniformity, what color your porch paint could be or how tall your fence was, now they were focusing on actual resident safety. And ironically, that shift brought the community closer together. Neighbors started looking out for each other in a more genuine way. For me, daily life settled into a calmer rhythm. I'd wake up, make breakfast, walk Maria to the bus stop, and then head to work. Weekends were spent tidying the house, exploring local parks with Maria, or inviting Jess and her family over for a barbecue. Each quiet, uneventful day felt like a gift, a far cry from that afternoon when my world nearly collapsed. Sometimes, Maria would ask about her dad, and I'd show her old photos or share stories she might not remember, like how he cried more than I did when she was born, or how he loved to sing out of tune in the car. Those memories were no longer quite as painful, Instead, they felt like a way to keep Marcus alive in our hearts. Through it all, I tried to instill in Maria a sense of empathy. Rules aren't the enemy, I'd tell her when we discussed what happened. They're there to help guide us. But if they ever stop us from being human, from caring for each other, then they're not being used the right way. She'd nod, her big brown eyes solemn. At 9 years old, soon to be 10, she had a better grasp of compassion than many adults I knew. Today, as I write this, Maria is healthy and happy. She's turned 10 and has discovered a love for soccer, a sport I never expected her to enjoy. She plays with a local youth team, sprinting up and down the field with a wide grin on her face, the wind ruffling her dark hair. Watching her chase after the ball, occasionally glancing over to see if I'm watching, reminds me of how close I came to losing her. Each time her team scores, I cheer a little louder than the other parents. I have the perspective of someone who knows exactly how fragile life can be. I sometimes wonder if Amber learned anything in her time behind bars. Did she spend those months reflecting on how an obsession with protocols could lead to tragedy? Or did she spend them stewing over how unfair the system was for punishing her? The truth is, I'll likely never know. After she was released, she didn't return to the gated community. Her house was quietly sold. I heard from neighbors that she's living somewhere else, presumably in another community, possibly working for a different HOA. Part of me hopes she changed, that she realized empathy should always come before bureaucratic rules. But I can't stake my sanity on hoping she found enlightenment. What I do know is that I learned a great deal about the power of compassion, or the destruction caused by the lack of it. Rules are important. Society couldn't function without some guidelines and structure. But in every situation, we have to remember to look at the human beings involved. A simple question, is this the right thing to do for the person in front of me? Can mean the difference between saving a life and losing one. I also learned about my own strength. Losing Marcus broke something inside me. I felt untethered, like I'd lost my anchor. But when I almost lost Maria, I discovered a reservoir of courage I never realized I had. I was willing to stand up against an entire community's rules if it meant keeping her alive. In the end, that motherly drive became unstoppable. I found my voice when it mattered the most. Most importantly, I discovered that the smallest oversights, like a mislabeled cookie, can cascade into dire consequences if compounded by uncaring bureaucracy. We're fragile creatures, reliant on each other's goodwill and sense of responsibility. Maria's life hung in the balance not just because she ate something she shouldn't have, but because a single person chose to wield power instead of empathy. To anyone reading this, whether you're a parent or not, I hope you never have to face a moment where you watch your loved one fight for air. But if you do, I pray you never encounter a locked gate guarded by a person who's forgotten how to care. If there's one takeaway from this story, it's that rules should protect people, not endanger them. When regulations get twisted into tools for control rather than safety, everyone suffers. Now, as for Maria, she's a normal kid again. She's careful about her allergies, of course. She's got her EpiPen and she knows how to check food labels. But she's not defined by that incident or by her father's death. She's a bright, curious, 10-year-old who loves soccer, painting, and telling me knock-knock jokes that make no sense. And every time I tuck her in at night, I'm grateful for the second chance we were given. I kiss her forehead, whisper goodnight, and turn off the lights, confident that tomorrow is waiting for us on the other side of dawn. I think back to that day often, how a stubborn woman nearly cost me the most precious person in my life. But I also think about the paramedics who risked their jobs by ramming the gate, about the nurses and doctors who worked tirelessly to save Maria's life, about the neighbors who supported me afterward and stood by my side in court. Ultimately, the gate incident could have torn me apart, but instead, it gave me a new mission. Every speech I give about allergy awareness, every local initiative I join for better emergency protocols, it's all a way of ensuring that maybe I can spare another parent the terror I felt that day. In the end, yes, rules can guide us. But empathy, compassion, and a willingness to do what's right, those are the real saving graces. And that's the story. A mother's fight against not just time, but the very rules designed to protect her. In a moment of crisis, Compassion should always come before protocol, and empathy should always outshine the authority of a locked gate. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Tailstrom.